Hello, this is Lawrence Patias. This is the first of two lectures on the memory of relationships and the malleability of memory of emotion. In this first lecture, I'll be talking about theory of memories of emotion and past research. In part two, in a different lecture, I'll be talking about more current research and applications of that research. So before I get on to talking about the theory and then some past research, let's first talk about how this relates to clinical psychology. So first of all, past research on false memories has provided really valuable cautionary information for clinicians who practice psychotherapy. And we'll talk more about that in a future lecture, but suffice to say, one of the problems that has become apparent is that false memories of whole events that did not happen have been generated in psychotherapies in the past, probably still happening today in the minority of cases, a very low minority of cases in the present. And we will talk more about that particular problem in the lecture next week. Now, the research related to that is that there is very many articles that have shown that memory in general is reconstructed, and Frederick Bartlett in 1932 wrote a book on this. There's been other researchers such as Elizabeth Loftus who have expanded this idea, and there's a lot of basic research on how cognition is constructed and how memory is constructed. It's not recorded, it's reconstructed. So research has demonstrated that childhood events that did not happen can be implanted as memories using suggestive post-event information, repetition of suggestion, or guided imagery techniques. There's been a few different articles that have demonstrated that. When I say a few, I mean hundreds. And so this research has helped inform many clinicians, if they read the literature as clinicians should, on how to avoid false memories in therapy. Nevertheless, there's a subtler type of memory distortion that is lesser known, which is the distortion of memory of emotions. And this lecture will talk about that specific subtle distortion. We'll talk about false memories in general next week. So past research has suggested that memories of emotions can change as current cognitions change over time. So as a memory trace of an emotion fades over time, in other words, as you forget the actual emotion itself, a person becomes more reliant on current cognitive appraisals of the past situation, or the person, if you're talking about a person rather than an event, when constructing their memory of how he or she felt. So the actual memory of the emotion fades very quickly, and then when you come to try and remember emotions later, you rely more and more on your evaluation of the past or of the situation as you recall them. So these theories are important in general to the whole human condition. So it's not specifically about clinical psychology, but let's talk a bit about how this relates to clinical psychology, because this is a course on clinical psychology. Now we're talking about the possibility that something might happen that was originally experienced as okay by a psychotherapy client, but over successive reappraisals of past events or of the people involved in those past neutral events, they come to feel differently about the event. And then they come to remember feeling emotions at the time that they did not actually feel at the time. Now let's illustrate this with a completely hypothetical example. Not a real example, just hypothetical. Just so you can think about how this would happen. So imagine that a person has a perfectly wonderful mother. Nothing wrong with this mother. A very good mother, doesn't do anything wrong to the child. And let's say that as a young toddler, that mother will have to bathe the child, and she does so perfectly well and normally. The child feels positive emotions, has fun splashing around, and feels joy for the most part. Now imagine that child grows up into an adult and at age 19 develops depression, perhaps due to the pressures of university or something like that, or a breakup of a relationship, and goes to a psychotherapist that helps the person reappraise their whole childhood, including the intentions and the character of their mother. Now let's say that that therapist or the client has just read a little bit too much Freud, or perhaps a book that was written recently that emphasizes the effects of trauma on depression, something like that. And they come to reappraise the intentions of the mother during bathing, for example, and the general character of the mother throughout the whole of childhood. The person then comes not to only feel differently about the bathing event, but also misremembers feeling negative emotions about the bathing they once had with their mother. I hope this is becoming self-apparent how this might cause both negative changes in a family relationship if the reappraisals are negative. It could lead to partial or total estrangement, perhaps, if you severely reappraise the intentions of the mother. And in extreme cases, even legal consequences, if the therapist and client take the reappraisals to extreme and repetitive lengths. For example, if the suggestion and the reappraisal is repetitive over years. For example, constantly reevaluating childhood and parents over a multi-year therapeutic relationship. Now, this has happened in the past in some in the minority of some therapies. You can think about other iterations too of this memory of emotion changes. It can apply to memories of emotions towards a person rather than an event, for example. So there might be not any one event, but just remembering how you felt towards a person years ago. There are many possible targets of such emotions too, such as spouses, partners, friends, and any number of events, both positive and negative events. And also there are two types of reappraisals. You can either reappraise in a rosy positive direction, and that comes with its own set of problems. Surprisingly, there are problems with reappraising upwardly. We'll talk about those at some point in today's lectures. Or you can reappraise in a negative direction, where the negative consequences are easier to imagine. Now use your imagination here. Perhaps pause the lecture for a while if you wish, and think of other examples of what could go wrong if therapists do not understand that reappraisal can change current emotions and memories of emotions. Ask yourself, have you ever reappraised a person or an event such that your memory of your emotions become inaccurate? So I insist that those learning the basics of clinical psychology should understand how reappraisals can change memories of emotion. And of course, all therapists should know about this too. Now let's talk for a while about the theory behind all the research that we're going to be looking at in this first lecture. So first of all, you have current appraisals, which is taken to be, in cognitive appraisal theory, the causal mechanism or a causal mechanism of emotions, of current emotions. So you appraise something, and let's assume for the first example that you appraise something accurately, and that accurate appraisal leads to an accurate current emotion. If you were to change your current appraisals, then you would expect from this model that current emotions would change too. So for example, if you appraise a situation you are in with a friend right now as being more positive than you previously appraised it, then your current positive emotions will increase and your negative emotions will go down. Now this is basically cognitive appraisal theory of emotion that we talked about in the last lecture. So you might think of this theory as being similar to Lazarus's theory, the idea that appraisals cause emotion. So as long as current appraisals are accurate or fair, then you're going to have an emotional reaction that is accurate to match that. But as those appraisals change, your current emotions will change too. So let's take an example. So let's say you're driving along in your car and somebody cuts across you in a way that is more dangerous than what you normally encounter. It creates an enormous rage because you're perceiving the intention of the agent in the car in front of you as being deliberate. So the cut-in was deliberate in your mind, and that creates, you know, a impedance of your goal to survive, to thrive in society. It impedes that survival goal that you have, and as a result you feel rage because it seemed to you that the intention was deliberate. So appraisals here include appraisal of the environment, but also appraisal of the intentions of agents within the environment. And if some of that environment changes, then your emotions will change. Let's take this example further. For example, let's say that you overtake that person who cut you off earlier. You're still feeling rageful, but then something causes you to reappraise the whole situation. You look across as you're overtaking, and you see that the driver is an elderly woman with a neck brace on. You suddenly reappraise that the intention of her to cut across you was probably some other problem. It probably was not intentional. So as soon as you see that, you realize it was not intentional, and your emotion changes immediately. As long as you believe the reappraisal deep down, then your emotion will automatically go from rage to something else, you know, perhaps sadness or concern, something like that. So this is how, you know, if you change the first box here, current appraisals, the second box, current emotion, will change automatically. Now notice the thickness of the line here. This is a very strong relationship, right? So a one-to-one relationship according to Lazarus. According to me, it's just one aspect, one cause of emotions. Now the bottom theory here is a different one, and you notice that there's a dotted line here, which means a less strong relationship. In other words, current appraisals here have a partial cause of memories of emotions. So in other words, if you change current appraisals by a lot, then memories of emotions will change by a lesser amount. If you change current appraisals by a tiny amount, then memories of emotions may not change. So it's a less strong relationship than the top relationship. Now this theory was first proposed, as far as I can tell, from Linda Levine in 1997. And the theory includes the idea that if you would change the first causal box, current appraisals, of a past event, then that will bias your memory of emotion for that event. Now this is a relationship that I think we are less aware of, right? So let's take that example that we used earlier and apply it to this situation. So let's say somebody cuts in front of you while you're driving, creates rage, and you stay rageful, you don't reappraise it for some time. And then a few days later, you get some information that the person did not intentionally cut you off. Let's say you look at some footage from your dash cam and you realize that there was no intention there. Now, here's the subtlety. You will not realize that your memories of your emotions will change in this situation. You realize that your current emotions change. Of course, you feel less rage. But what will happen is when you are asked, how did you feel when the person cut you off a few days ago, you will now report as feeling less rageful than you actually did. So this is how it works. You reappraise in the present how an event went down, the intentions around the event, the whole environment. You reappraise the whole thing in a positive direction, let's say. Your negative emotions then are remembered less negatively, so you underestimate how rageful you felt at the time. Now this is a very subtle change in memory that I don't think we're aware of. Now, you will recall in a previous lecture a few weeks ago, we talked about catharsis theory as not being a particularly scientific or supported theory. And indeed, I think it is wrong. But one that is still part of our culture, and this theory is still influential. So, what would catharsis theory predict about accuracy of memory of emotions? Would it predict something different to the theories that we just mentioned on appraisal theories of emotion? For example, well, yes, catharsis theory views emotion as a pristinely stored entity. Along with that belief came the idea that it could be pristinely remembered, accurately remembered, as if it's a stored unit, and resolved, as Freud predicted, and this theory has been preserved in more modern therapy theories as well, that center around the notion that old emotions can and should be relived in order to expel them from the body, in order to be cured. Now notice that this would predict, what this would predict about the accuracy of memory of emotions. Hidden deep inside this catharsis theory is the idea that memories of emotions will be accurate. Therefore, clinicians working with this cathartic model of emotions will not be concerned about changing memories because they may believe memories of emotion cannot be changed. Instead, they believe that they can be retrieved pristinely. So there are a few levels of problems with this theory. On one level, you have the belief that retrieving emotions is curative, so why not do that if it cures people? And that is not borne out by the evidence, right? And on a second level of analysis, you have the prediction that memories of emotion will be so stable that you can reappraise events and people ad nauseum without ever worrying about distorting memories. So these are seriously flawed predictions that could form the core of beliefs that is more iatrogenic to clients. In other words, do more harm. The theory itself, the therapy itself does harm. The type of beliefs that give psychologists a bad name. It is hardly surprising that some people in society think it is better to steer clear of therapists if some therapists believe this and practice this. We can recover trust in clients by using reliable and supported theories. Psychology should never sink into postmodern ideas such as the idea that all these theories have merit. The truth is, not everything is true. And psychology should endeavor to keep that idea that not everything is true and aim at being a science. Now, another outdated theory is the idea that emotions are indelible and are restored in reverberating circuits in the limbic system. Now, Joseph Ledoux came up with this idea based on his experiments in 1989. I think he also wrote on this in 1991 as well. And on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about that 1989 paper. So the idea is that emotions are stored in the limbic system, and they are kind of stored in an indelible form, in other words, in a form that cannot be changed. And of course, this will lead to predictions about how memories of emotions will be recalled too. Again, it's in the same line of theorizing as a cathartic theory, and indeed it would be influenced by catharsis theory, in that if emotions are indelible, as Ledoux put forward in 1989, then we would expect that when they are recalled, you are recalling some stored substance, such that when the emotions come back out, they are accurate if they are stored in this way. So it predicts accuracy in memories of emotion too. Now, these two theories are not borne out by the evidence in humans when you ask people to recall their emotions over time. So these are theories I'm putting forward here, but I want to make sure that nobody misses the idea here that both of these theories are flawed, and they are competing theories that are not well supported. So let's take this article by Ledoux and colleagues that we looked at on the last slide and apply some critical thinking to it. First of all, notice the title. It's talking about the indelibility of subcortical emotional memories. Hold that in mind as we talk about it. Now, in this study, they used foot shocks and lights paired together in the learning phase to induce fear learning in rats. Notice the subjects are rats, not humans. So this is classical conditioning, where you show lights at the same time that foot shocks occur at the bottom of the cage. And later on, after learning has occurred, you just shine the lights in the cage and without the foot shocks, and the rats show that they have associated lights with foot shocks, and they show fear, right? So fear in rats is measured by the freezing in place that they do when they're presumably fearful. What they found was, in contrast to learning, extinction of a fear response was prolonged and even prevented by cortical ablation. So there was this association such that when you damage the cortex, that's what cortical ablation means. When you damage the cortex above the limbic system, so just the top part of the cortex in a rat, the learning was extinguished, right? So the rat no longer learned the association. However, they found that the fear response itself was not extinguished, so it was prolonged, and the fear response was even prevented from it being extinguished, right? So the idea came from this is maybe the cortex is involved in learning, and the limbic system underneath the cortex is involved in the fear itself. And in fact, Ledoux and colleagues wrote in their paper, this resistance to extinction of subcortical emotional memories may explain certain aspects of emotional memory in man. Now, the question is that generalization justified from this research? And from this, you might gather that maybe emotional memories are indelible, right? Now, is this justifiable? So what are the flaws of the study here? First of all, the subjects were rats, not humans. Secondly, the type of learning measured here is just classical conditioning. It's not autobiographical memories in humans. And thirdly, they're only dealing with one emotion here, which is fear, So you have to be careful at generalizing from fear into the other emotions. So as you can see, there is some problem with the idea of generalizing these findings in rats to say that emotion is indelible in humans, or even that fear is indelible in humans. Now, is there any other research that shows that emotions or memories of emotions are indelible or reliable or recalled in such a way that it seems that emotions are stored and then recalled pristinely? Well, if you cherry pick some past research, yes, you can find some that might give you a little bit of evidence, right? So in Brown and Cullick's flashbulb memory research, one of the first research papers to use the word flashbulb, the initial study gave the impression that emotional events might be stored accurately. And this was questions about how the participants felt about and what they remembered about the Kennedy assassination over a decade before. So the idea that came out of this, written by Brown and Cullick, was that emotional memories that are very important to the individual, such as news events that impact your life, are cut and print, just like a flashbulb on a camera. And it's like a photograph that's taken at the time of the flash, or the extreme emotion, or the high emotion. So the idea that emotional memories are stored in a much more accurate and permanent way than other types of memories. Now, this was actually turned out to be flawed research and flawed interpretations, because when they did better research in subsequent flashbulb memory, they showed that a great amount of unreliability in these memories of important news events, especially in memories of emotion, and into other types of memories too, surrounded the important news event. You know, for example, Nisa and Harsh studied people's memories of how they remembered the Challenger shuttle disaster that happened in the 1980s. Crucially, they improved their design compared to Brown and Cullick by measuring those memories longitudinally. In other words, they had more than one time point in which they asked people to recall what they remembered, and they found that people were inconsistent from one time point to the next on their flashbulb type memories of where they were when they first heard about the Challenger disaster, what they felt, and so on. Another flashbulb memory article that showed something similar to Nisa and Harsh was the Hurst et al. Paper in 2015 that was a follow-on study on their longitudinal study on memories about September 11th, 2001. And like other studies, more recent studies in flashbulb memory research, they found that memories of emotion were especially poorly remembered compared to other types of memories. So it gives credence to the idea that emotions are very difficult to store and to remember. In fact, it gives evidence that emotions are not stored in the classical sense. It supports the idea that emotions, in terms of memory, fade very quickly, and then later we're very much reliant on cognitions to reconstruct how we probably felt, and our current appraisals of that past event. So the conclusion from this is, in fact, these But flashbulb memory research is not supportive of the idea that emotional memories are cut and print and that emotions are indelible or emotional memories are indelible or anything like that. And in fact, flashbulb memories as a term is a misnomer. In other words, it is a false name. Emotional memories are not stored as if they were a flashbulb photograph. Now let's separate the two theories that we've been talking about so far, the oppositional theories, one saying that emotion is indelible and the other one saying that memories of emotion are very malleable and susceptible to change according to current appraisals, right? So we're comparing catharsis theory to cognitive appraisal theory. And we're focusing in here on memories of emotion here rather than just current emotions as we focused on in a previous week's lecture. So let's take the COVID-19 news event as an example to think through how these two theories would predict different things, right? So a few weeks ago, we heard news about COVID-19. It affects our lives, it's a danger, so it has an emotional aspect to it. Now, the question is, could we think back to late February or early February and recall accurately how we felt at that time, even if the news has changed since then, right? So one theory, catharsis theory, would predict that yes, we can recall accurately exactly how we felt about that event. The other would predict, cognitive appraisal theory would predict that no, we probably are going to misremember how we felt in terms of fear or concern at the time that we first heard about the COVID-19 story. And of course, if it is true, as I think it is, that cognitive appraisal theory will predict more accurately how we felt, we are going to misremember COVID-19 as we reappraise COVID-19. So in other words, if we were not fearful at the end of January about COVID-19, and we later learn that it's a much more dangerous disease, we're going to misremember being very, very concerned at the end of January, more concerned than we actually were. So we will misremember. Perhaps we will even misremember our political stance on what should be done about COVID-19, and look back and criticize other people who were not cautious enough, misremembering that the fact that we were not cautious either. And of course, it can work the other way too. If later on we find that the death rate is much lower percentage than expected, perhaps in a month or in a year's time, our reappraisals will again alter our memories of emotion of how we felt, in February of 2020 about COVID-19, and that we might go ahead and criticize others who were feeling differently about it. Then we remember that we were feeling about it, when in fact we may have been feeling the same as those we are criticizing. So when the press looks back at the time and the decision making in January and February, the journalists will probably be having and experiencing this memory distortion in themselves that they do not even know is happening. They may misremember themselves being more concerned than they were, when concern over the virus is very high, as it is right now, or they may have the opposite type of memory distortion if we start to reappraise the danger of COVID-19 in the downward direction in the future, after the crisis has subsided perhaps. In fact, you yourself might be able to examine how accurate your memory is on COVID-19 by making a prediction about how you felt, so just trying to remember how you felt, let's say on January the 10th, 2020, and then just writing down how you think you felt about it, how you think what your opinion was at the time on how we should deal with it, writing that out, and then going back and looking at all the emails that you sent on February the 10th and examining whether your memory of how you felt, or your position as well, not only how you felt, is consistent with how you remembered it before you looked at the emails. So as demonstrated on the last slide, memories of emotions can be important and can be applied to our lives. So we use memories of our emotions in many decisions and judgments that we make. For example, in a forensic setting, we might rely on how we felt when an event happened to us in order to ascertain whether we should press charges. For example, if we remember that we felt great distress at an event, we might go forward and press charges about that event. Also, in personal relationships, you can think about how important memories of emotion are. So, for example, when we're deciding whether to marry somebody, we will in part be relying on how we remember feeling in previous years with that partner. Remembering the first year with that partner, the second year with that partner, and so on. And if those memories of emotions are distorted in some way, it might affect our better decision making as we make those decisions. It will certainly affect those decisions. It's probably not the only factor that affects relationship decisions, but that's one of them. So these are just a couple of examples of why memories of emotions are important in relationships. And now we're going to transition over into looking more deeply into the evidence for the malleability of memory of emotions. Now, one of your readings this week is Levine's pioneering study on reconstructing memory for emotions. So Levine found that supporters of the United States presidential candidate called Ross Perot tended to bias their memories of emotion about his withdrawal. So the participants first rated their current emotions towards the event of Perot's withdrawal just a few days after his withdrawal from the 1992 presidential race. Some supporters stayed loyal through the whole campaign and after the election, others did not. And these differences in appraisal towards Perot's candidate, Perot as a candidate, provided naturally occurring changes in appraisal of the target event. So in other words, some people's appraisals changed in the upward direction, some people's appraisals stayed the same. So it was like a naturally occurring experiment. Now, the interesting thing here is Perot re-entered the race a few months later in October. And after the election in November, in which Perot came third, but he captured almost 20% of the vote, Levine again asked the participants what they remembered of their emotions when Perot had originally withdrawn through the race. And you can imagine in some participants their appraisals would have changed. In other participants, their appraisals would have changed in another direction. So she found that their memories of their emotions were biased in accordance with how they had reappraised Perot's withdrawal. For example, if Perot had lost their support after his decision to withdraw, and they still held diminished appraisals of him after the election, they would remember their initial anger fairly accurately. So if their appraisals stayed the same, then they would be fairly accurate about their memories of emotion. In contrast, those Perot supporters who had turned against Perot after his withdrawal, but reappraised the situation after the election, misremembered being less angry about his withdrawal than they actually were, right? So that's, as appraisals change, and memories of emotion change in the same direction. So, for example, just to kind of summarize, after withdrawal, these individuals would say, I'm so angry and I don't support him. And then after the election, they come to say, I wasn't angry at all. When he withdrew, I support the guy. Because their appraisals had moved in the direction of supporting the person, Perot, at the time of recall after the election. Now, also in the Levine study, returning supporters, in other words, supporters who returned to be fans of Perot, overestimated their reports of feeling hope after his withdrawal. So after his withdrawal, right afterwards, they would say, and this is just me making up what they say, there is no hope and I don't support him. After the election, they remember that time differently. I remember still feeling hopeful even when he withdrew, and I support the guy. So as you can see, the case for the cognitive appraisal view of memories of emotion is building, and we're finding more and more articles to support that view. Let's go over a few more that also support that idea. So in the SAFER article in 2001, they found that memories of grief are malleable according to how individuals' current grief changes over time, and their current appraisals change with that current grief as well. So this is an article about following individuals whose spouse died, asking them how they felt, how much grief they feel, and then following up years later. And they did indeed find that memories of grief change over time. So that was a longitudinal study, but there's some experiments too. Kuhler and Safer did what they called the first controlled experiment to investigate memories of emotion. If you remember the 1997 paper 1 year earlier, that was not an experiment. That was, in fact, a longitudinal study. So this is an experiment that experiments in general help establish cause in a much more reliable way than longitudinal studies. There are exceptions to that, but in general. So graduate students were randomly assigned to be told that they had passed a comprehensive exam, and another group of graduate students were randomly assigned not to be told yet that they had passed. And then both sets of graduate students were asked to estimate their pre-exam anxiety, to recall how they felt before the exam. Those graduate students who got the good news tended to overestimate their pre-exam anxiety. So there was some, in some sense, the change of how they appraised the whole event led to an overestimation of past memories of emotion. And that overestimation was compared to those who received no feedback. So there are only a limited number of experiments on memories of emotion that attempt to examine the role of appraisal or changes of appraisal in memories of emotion. And they tend to demonstrate that we need more experiments to solidify this causal relationship and to be more sure about it. And in the next lecture, I'll talk about some more recent research as well. So Hovsepian and Levine randomly assigned participants into groups that varied on how they appraise the pain that they felt when putting their arm in ice water. So they were instructed differently on how to deal with that pain, and how in one group they were asked to reappraise it, another group they were asked to suppress it, the pain, etc. Now, they did not, in fact, find a main effect for appraisal group on memory of pain compared to the suppression or the control group. So this demonstrates that more experiments are needed here. But they did find an interaction. Only within those scoring highly on anxiety sensitivity was there a difference between the appraisal up condition and the control condition. So only, in other words, only within some individuals did they find the relationship that changing appraisals led to changing memories of pain. So as you can see, experimental work is less than complete in establishing a consistent causal relationship between cognitions and memories of emotion, or changes in cognitions and memories of emotion. So more research is needed. But there has been some longitudinal data, and you can sometimes infer cause from longitudinal studies. You have to be very careful in your thinking when you're establishing cause, but nevertheless, they are very useful studies. So one longitudinal study, for example, was done by Levine et al. In 2001, asking people how they remember feeling right after they heard that O.J. Simpson was received a not guilty verdict from the court case for the murder of his wife. So they found that changes over time in memory for happiness, anger, and surprise were found in directions consistent with current appraisals of the not guilty verdict. In other words, it's not an experiment, but as people's current appraisals of the not guilty verdict changed over time, their memories of happiness, anger, and surprise changed with them. Similarly, in a longitudinal study by Levine et al. In 2005, studying the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, they measured memories of emotions 3 months after the event and 8 months after the event in order to ascertain how consistent people were in their memories of emotions. They found that those who appraised the attacks of having less impact recalled lower negative emotions after 9/11. And in these participants, negative emotions decreased with time. And in contrast, those who appraised the attacks as having higher impact, being more important in other words, showed an increase over time of memories of negative emotions. So again, there was some relationship between appraisals and memories of emotion. So as you can see, longitudinal studies bolster the case that appraisals bias memories of emotion, but the solid case for a causal relationship requires more research. So we're not finished for today's set of lectures, but we are finished on the first lecture. And let's summarize where we are so far. So we talked about how that there's different predictions of catharsis and appraisal theories for memories of emotion. Catharsis theory might predict a kind of consistency of memory of emotions, whereas appraisal theory predicts inconsistency and changes according to appraisals.
And I would argue the weight of evidence that we've put forward today tends to balance and pull down or support appraisal theory more than the catharsis theory. And we talked about how this general theory of memory of emotion being malleable might apply to relationships and therapy, and we'll talk some more about that in the next lecture too. For example, we'll talk about memories of emotion that we have towards our parents from childhood, memories that we are recalling as adults, which of course has relevance for relationships and relevance to clinical psychology.